Good day, everyone. It's Alan Schimmel from MediaOps, DevOps.com, Security Boulevard, Container Journal. Thanks for joining us on another webinar. I think this is really going to be a great webinar, especially if you're either thinking of or already on a Kubernetes infrastructure. Today's webinar is titled Running on Amazon EKS, How Greenlight Security Gets It Right. And if you're not familiar with Greenlight, you will be in just a short while. Before I introduce our guest and get started, just a quick little housekeeping. We do use the GoToWebinar webinar system here at MediaOps. And as such, most of you probably see a GoToWebinar control panel in your right-hand corner of your screen. If you look at that panel, you'll see it's broken up into different sections. There's really only two sections I want to call to your attention right now. One is marked questions. And if you hit the little arrow next to the word questions, you'll see it expand. We use that to ask questions of all things. So if you have any questions for our panelists today about either what we're talking about or something germane to your situation with Kubernetes or what you're thinking, please use that area for questions, and it gives you a lot of different things. Number one, if you're like me, you don't have to be worried about forgetting your question by the time we get around to questions. Number two, there is a record of it. If we get a lot of questions, we're not able to answer them all, we can try to get them an answer to your question via email or what have you, and get you a response, which you're entitled to, right? And number three, we have a queue, so we see how many questions there are, so we know how much time to allocate for this. And it just makes for a better, smoother operations for our webinar. The next section I want to call your attention to is down at the bottom for most of you, and that's the chat session. Here on MediaOps webinars, we use chat for technical support. We do have people standing by if for some reason maybe the audio is not working, the slides aren't moving, progressing. But you can still get to chat, hopefully. Let us know in there. We'll do our best to try to help you. Usually it's not a system-wide problem. It could be just an individual thing. But if you have any technical issues, please use the chat. But if you have questions for our guest, use the questions box. Easy. With that being said, as I mentioned today, today's webinar is about how Greenlight, along with their security partner and provider StackRox, have navigated the Amazon EKS while their business is growing exponentially. So it's going to be a great webinar. In order to really kind of focus in though on what our speakers are going to really focus and emphasize, I want to do a quick poll, even before we introduce everyone, to get an idea of where the audience is in terms of your own Kubernetes experience and journey. And I realize people will come in late and what have you, but now's as good a time as any if it's okay. So I'm going to pop a poll up here. It's a multiple choice question. You shouldn't have to think too long. And I'm only going to leave it up for maybe 10 seconds. But guys, it really makes the webinar interactive. It really helps us focus in on what's going to help you. So please take a moment, answer the question, and let's hit it. So where are you in your Kubernetes journey? Just select one of the following, please. You're still learning about it. You're using it in a test environment, perhaps using it in minimally anyway in a production environment, or you're extensively using it in your production environment. So if you wouldn't mind, take a moment, give us your vote. I hate to close these off before I get 66%, and we're not quite there yet. So come on, the last few of you who haven't voted, help me out here. Come on, just a few more. We're going to close this off. Give me your votes in 3, 2, 1. That's it. Okay, we're right there. We're right there. Share results. Let's see what our survey says. Wow, that's great. I'm a little surprised. almost half, 49% of you are still in the learning about it phase. Over a quarter are still in the using it only in a test environment phase. And then, well, 17 and 7 is 24. About a quarter of you are using Kubernetes in production, but only 17%, minimally so. I'm going to ask our attendees to comment on, it's not our attendees, excuse me, our panelists to comment on that. But first, we have to go back to our slides, which should be able to be going to, right? We're closed on the poll. Asking for some help from our engineers here. How do we get back to our slides? I know, Ken, you are in charge of slides.
I should already be presenting.
I'm not seeing slides. Are you seeing your slides?
I am. Let me try to share again.
If you don't mind. Oh, there we go. Okay, we're there. Wow. Walk through that one. That's why I moderate these things. Anyway, by the way, guys, that was Ken, who is going to be here, but I'm not going to introduce our audience. We have a special introduction from my friend Michelle McLean, who is VP at StackRox and someone I've had the pleasure of knowing for longer than she wants to admit to. So Michelle McLean, why don't you take it over?
Absolutely, Alan. Thank you so much. And I'm super excited to introduce Ken and Chris from Greenlight because I have an oddly personal interest in this topic. I got to know Greenlight initially hearing about them on the StackRox side when I was hearing about there's this really cool company and they do this cool stuff where they give debit cards to kids. And I was like, oh, that's fascinating. And then I came home from work and I was telling my husband and my kids, like, hey, there's this really cool idea. And my husband walks into the office, walks back and holds up a Greenlight envelope. And he goes, we're already customers. I just didn't get to tell you yet. And I was like, what? And the kids were super excited. So, you know, I grew up with a mom who made me budget, had it all in envelopes. And this is just the digital answer to how do you teach kids to have, you know, some notion of what's going on with finances, some attachment to money. How do you encourage them to have savings goals? And I can tell you, my kids got to use their debit cards at a little local market here in the Bay Area about 3 weeks ago for the first time, and they were bursting with pride. They could not have been more excited. So it is my true personal joy to introduce Ken De La Guera and Chris Byrd from Greenlight, and I'm super excited to have them share their journey about building the company and adopting Kubernetes and then bringing security onto that platform. So guys, thank you so much for being here and take it away.
Fantastic.
All right. So I guess, Ken, if you can progress to the next slide, if that's feasible. Awesome. Probably should have had this up when Michelle was doing this. It's kind of neat to hear people out in the wild, your parents and children that are actually using this. It's been kind of a strange experience. When I joined, you probably weren't going to run into somebody in the wild that was using this, but as we've grown like crazy in the past 18 months, 2 years, it's more and more common that I run across people that actually have the app or know of us or have seen something or know someone that's using it and have had benefit from their children. So it's kind of cool. But just to tack onto that, who we are, to give you some context about what we are, what we do, how we do it. We were in the same boat that it seems like a lot of the poll or the attendees were, where we were not on Kubernetes. We were a pretty monolithic application. We built what essentially you see there in front of you as a literally like a standard startup, one guy, a dream in a basement, and you build out something and you're using as many shared services as you possibly can, and you're just trying to get something out functionally that will do what you think it'll do to see if you can get enough people to believe in what you're doing and move forward. And that's where we landed. But the mission of what we're here to do is to try to understand how we can help parents raise more financially aware children. And so you'll hear that term a lot that we throw out, parents and children, parents and children. We're very baked into that concept and idea. But it's interesting, like how we believed in the idea, believed in the concept, started our journey with this, just stringing together a bunch of services on AWS, and then it seemed like overnight, like the switch flipped, and now we had to start dealing with problems that they were good problems for us to have, but problems that we never thought we would be running into from the beginning. But Ken, if you want to jump to the next slide. So above and beyond what you saw on the first slide, I guess most people associate what we are with a debit card, and they say we're just like a debit card for kids. So yes, that's true. We do have debit cards in which we engage in relationships with partners in order to issue cards and to manage payments on cards so that you as a parent can determine where your kid spends money and help them make smart decisions about that. But beyond that, we're also a financial services provider for parents in that we're giving tools to help them earn money through chores and allowances, to help them save money, put it towards goals they have, but also to give money away as charities as part of an overall strategy on how you want to mandate your relationship with money and how you want to teach your kids about money. I think some of the more heated arguments we've had are some of the psychological things about whether chores should be intrinsic rewards or paid rewards, or like you'll have people with fiery opinions on those things. But we've gone from these just being kind of background conversations to actually having some real scale on what our platform is. In 2019, we had over $150 million that children were supporting, and you think about this, it's kind of crazy. These are not children with $20,000, $30,000 401ks or whatever, right? This is like $5 here, $10 there. So it's pretty awesome to see that much money collected and what children can do with that money and how parents are helping them make the most of that. We completed 1.8 million chores. Some of the funny stories about that are we get the top analytical chores for a given week or month. It's pretty much always the top three things that parents are asking their kids to do: do the dishes, clean your room, clean up after the dog in the backyard. I have exactly those three problems. I would probably put them in the reverse order, but I have those three problems, and I have those three chores for my kids as well. Saving for money, another fun activity I've seen with my kids is that they kind of use this as a game and they're competing against each other. And I know one of my children would never save money unless I forced her to, but sibling rivalries are a pretty powerful concept. So them fighting it out and wanting to do that, it's been neat to see how they have started to think about savings differently, especially in this age where I know a lot of us probably grew up with piggy banks and things like that, where money was physical, but money's not physical anymore. So how do you visualize and show that to people? So that's one of the services and things we're offering there. And then the slide that always gets me is every time it comes up that we talk about this. It's amazing that kids are even thinking about and giving to charities. One of the charities that is most common is the World Wildlife Federation, WWF, but then a lot of people see that and they think they're given to some sort of wrestling federation or something. But it's cool to see that the kids having a much broader perspective of what finances are and how this is rolling out and impacting their lives and how this is impacting parents' lives. So our journey really from where we were when we started this idea to where we are now is kind of on this timeline, broad strokes, and where we're going to focus in on today is the technological decisions we had to make in order to go from an idea in a basement to a platform that could support hundreds of thousands of families, millions of users, and scale to not only being a product where we're directly offering a service to parents, but also a product where we're allowing other financial institutions to build services on top of our platform. And that level of maturity has been a recent thing, and that is one of the major reasons why we had to change how we were thinking about our technical stack and how we had to go from that 49% of thinking about Kubernetes to that 8 or 10% or whatever it was of actively, extensively pursuing and using Kubernetes. So as I mentioned, we founded in 2014. Oh, sorry, you want to do this one? I was going to make one more point about that, Ken, before you moved on this one. I think the big thing that we had to sort out in our journey, right, is that we were on AWS. All of our services were very siloed, monolithic stacks. We don't have a bunch of people with operations teams. We didn't have a dedicated security team. So when we first came out in the market, those weren't big deals because we're just trying to figure out how we get funding and how do we survive another day. Once we get funding, once we start thinking about, okay, we've got a product, how do we mature it? How do we scale it? What does that look like? Then you start having to ask yourself, okay, is my Elastic Beanstalk deployment going to scale? Do these ECS Fargate services allow me to speak to each other? How do I put common security mechanisms around this? How do I standardize my processes? And that led us, kind of forced us down a path that when we had a scale of about 10 users within the company or 10 engineers in the company, it's possible for those 10 engineers to work on the same service. Now, when you're looking at 50, 60, 100 engineers, it's not possible for all of those people to be running on the same service. It's a Martin Fowler nightmare. It's everybody scrumming for the same code and stuff churning, and we just hit a complete wall as to where we were going with what our deployments were, and that forced us into a microservices model. And then the natural progression to that is that running microservices, thinking about Kubernetes, and then thinking about how we're going to do this. So the combination of how we're scaling, the need for our organization to grow to meet all of the complexity needs and the feature needs that we have, the need to support partners and the different integration patterns that they're going to have, all led us down the path of microservices, Kubernetes, and those solve problems, but they also create other problems. And I think that's kind of the moral of our story, is those other problems that start to arise and how you can think about those problems and that complexity and start to attack it. So Ken, now you can jump forward. All right. So Ken, if you want to jump on this one, you can. If not, I will speak to this, but I'll reiterate the points that we made before. This is kind of an interesting slide because what you'll see is the graph is the number of families that we have on our platform. And this is prior to any partnerships. This doesn't count any partnerships. This is just our direct user base. So you can see the incredible scale that we've been going through in the past 18 months. And where we hit a wall organizationally and started thinking about, oh, we're going to be in trouble, that first marker right there in the middle of 2018, that's roughly the time that I joined the company. And we realized that the stack we have right now works for the base we have, but if we double, triple, quadruple in size, we're going to hit a wall, and we're not going to have answers for a lot of things. So that led us down the journey to start thinking about microservices. We lay a Kubernetes strategy in place. We start thinking about microservices. We start doing those things, and then the game changes. What we thought was the problem set became a much bigger problem set because we started having discussions with partners, and partners are very interested to use our services. And when we add partners to the platform, we've added additional compliance measures, additional security guidelines. We've drastically increased the complexity of our deployment process, the number of environments we're supporting, the number of raw services we're supporting, and all the configuration within there. And I think a point Ken made, which he'll probably make again later, which is a good one, is that generally, following best practice and people that have done this in the past, your organization is not going to scale one-to-one with your user base, and you don't want it to. So as we started growing a number of families, that didn't mean we automatically had the money to go hire a ton of engineers. So the problems we were solving meant that we just had to be better, smarter, faster with what we had. And that's where we started trying to be smart about how we leverage partnerships, how we leverage cloud services, and making decisions about what we control and what we don't control. So Ken, I don't know if you want to take it from there.
Yeah, there's definitely a few things I would add, and I'll even start by just commenting on what you just said. We didn't have the money to go out and hire the additional engineers. I would argue that even if we did, it's not always the best strategy, right? Just because you have 10 engineers and now you have 100 doesn't mean you're doing 10 times the amount of work, right? There's definitely a lot of overhead that comes there. So as we started this out, our main concern was, are we viable? What is MVP? And our horizon was maybe a year, 2 years, maybe 3 years max, right? Get the product launch, get it working, get it running, get it full of features and things that are going to provide a lot of value to the kids and parents using our platform, etc. But once we moved past that stage and once we started seeing this growth, the discussion very quickly changed from just MVP to how do we make sure it is scalable and performant, and we're able to also now deal with compliance and security and things that previously weren't as important or were easier to manage just due to the complexity, but just drastically changed overnight.
Agreed.
So quick polling question.
We wanted to, yeah.
Yes.
I to throw in
Okay,
another polling question. Learn a little bit about where people are running their environments.
Yep. So if you are running Kubernetes today, and based upon your previous answers, as I said, about 24% are in some sort of production and roughly another 25%. So about half of you are running Kubernetes either in test or production today. Where are you? On-prem only, in the cloud only, or hybrid, both on-prem and in the cloud? So,
and I would say even if you're not running it yet, but you know where you would run it when you do run it, that'd be great information to have too.
That's what I was looking for, Michelle. That opens it up to all of you. So please, everyone, take a moment and give us your thoughts here. Are you looking to run Kubernetes on-prem, in the cloud, or a combination of both?
And for those of you that are combining, I will offer my sympathies right now.
Well, don't want to influence the vote here now, Chris, do you? All right, I'm going to close this off in another 5 seconds. 5, 4, please get involved here. Vote. It's good practice. 3, 2, 1. I'm going to close the poll and show the results. Well, 21% on-premise and in the cloud in a hybrid environment. It's higher than I would have thought. I thought the cloud would be higher. Panel, what do you think about this?
I think that 21% is doing the work of the gods. I've worked in companies that have had to do this in the past, and it's not an easy challenge. I will say that. So you will have the problems that we faced and more in this. So I can only pretend to help you. I've been in your shoes. I can pretend to help you from that perspective. But you guys will have fun problems to go through from that perspective. So I wish you the best.
Yeah, I would also add to that. I think both on-prem and hybrid just introduce a new set of problems, and I'm obviously biased, but I just don't think the trade-off is really worth it, especially when you have offerings like AKS or GKE or EKS. There's very few reasons to go on-prem short of you're just using Kubernetes at such a scale that you can save money by running it in-house instead of paying Amazon's bill, which frankly is a thing, but it's quite the scale.
Yeah, and I reiterate that. Like, I've been in companies that have very specific guidelines. Like I've been asked to put a Kubernetes cluster on an oil rig sitting in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico because they have no internet connectivity. Like, okay, there's a case for you need to do this. But we are doing this at scale in a cloud provider for large financial institutions, which arguably have as much security constraints as anyone on the globe outside of a government organization. So it can be done, but there are a lot of security issues and guidelines you're going to have to like come across to sort out, in addition to just norms of the organization, which are not insurmountable, but can also be a real constraint.
Absolutely. All right, let's move along if we can. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So Chris covered some of this earlier, but I want to reiterate it because I feel it's very important to understand our tech journey, right? Originally, our application was a monolith. We only had a handful of engineers, and their focus was, how do we build the product? How do we add the feature? How do we go to market and see if what we have is viable and is what the market needs? So what that ended up looking like for us was, it was a monolithic Node.js application that was running in Beanstalk. And Beanstalk, to its credit, does do a reasonable job of being an orchestrator, right? It will automatically launch your load balancers, anything you possibly need. It will launch your servers, just give it your code and it essentially does the rest. It absolutely has a lot of drawbacks though. Probably the biggest thing is that Beanstalk uses EC2 containers, which means that as you're launching new instances, as you're rolling back, as you're scaling up, you have to wait for that EC2 instance to be launched, which, if you have any experience with that, can take up to 10 minutes. And then in general, you're just locked into Beanstalk's mode of working, which just very much limits what you're able to do. Again, when you're first starting out, just engineers, you're not very opinionated on the infrastructure. That's perfectly fine. But as we scaled, this just wasn't going to work, and it wasn't going to scale. And I mean, I would argue that even having to wait 10 minutes to scale up your infrastructure in case you get an influx of traffic, it's just too long to wait.
So here's a funny story where our CEO, Tim Sheehan, was out one day. We didn't know kind of what he was doing, but from an engineering org, I saw a TV on, and he was on the TV. I don't know if it was CNN or something like that, right? He was showed up on the TV, and Greenlight was across the bottom. And we like looked at each other like, did anybody know this was going to happen? And nobody knew it. And then all of a sudden we started seeing spikes in traffic, and everybody was like running to hit the button to start the 10-minute clock on Elastic Beanstalk to get it to start to scale up before new registrations were coming
in. Yeah, case in point, right there. Again, when you're a 10-person company, all sitting in the same room, right across the desk from marketing or whomever, it's even easier to have that conversation, right? But when you're up to 100 people plus, it's no longer that easy, and you often get little surprises like that. So from the monolith, we started asking the question, how can we scale up? How can we be performant? How can we have this application do what we need it to do, working with the resources we have? And the reason I bring that up is because, again, our scalability shouldn't be tied to how many people are we able to hire. And then in addition to that, based on the people we are able to hire, we're able to define our tolerance for how much overhead, how much complexity we're able to take. One of the things I'll take the opportunity to say right now is Kubernetes takes overhead. Kubernetes is not just a launch and start using it immediately and all your problems are taken care of, right? So when we were talking about what does the future platform look like, we evaluated EKS, both with hosting your own hosts, and with Fargate, we looked at Kubernetes, we looked at a ton of other options, and we landed on Kubernetes because it gives us the right amount of complexity or control, while also offloading enough of the overhead that it made sense for us. So once we made that change, our new architecture changed from a monolith to having a lot of microservices. We decided to use namespaces as environment boundaries. So in this slide, you can see that one cluster for us would encompass the dev environment, the stage environment, and the QA environment. And then obviously, if an environment's traffic requires its own cluster, that's perfectly fine too. And then eventually, as we launched into having partners, we made the decision for them to have their own dedicated clusters as well. The reason I point that out is because we went from having a Beanstalk deployment to having 3 Kubernetes clusters for us to overnight essentially having 15 Kubernetes clusters. And overnight, we went from having a handful of services, let's say between 5 and 10 services, most of them in Node.js, to a majority of them, or I'm sorry, to having almost 30 services and having a polyglot environment where all of a sudden it wasn't just Node.js, it was Java and Kotlin, Node.js, Golang. And the reason I want to emphasize those changes is because that made managing security a lot harder. In Beanstalk, it was fairly straightforward. Keep the image updated. It's just Node.js anyway, so I can just subscribe to a feed somewhere, get an email, know what's happening. When all of a sudden we have 30 services, all with their own dependencies, using a myriad of languages, it's no longer that easy. And again, whatever solution we went with couldn't involve, hey, just hire a SOC and have them spend the entire day monitoring everything happening out there so that we could be aware of it. In addition to that, by going to Kubernetes, like Chris said earlier, we solved one problem, but we definitely introduced a lot of problems as well. For anybody that's a fan of using instance profiles, that becomes different in Kubernetes, because if you attach an instance profile to a host, it now means that any container running on that host has those permissions. You have a few options to try to address that. You could try to do something where you say, hey, this host is special and only certain nodes or certain pods run on this, but that's obviously going to introduce a lot of its own issues. So that's where we ended up looking at something called Kube2 IAM, which just lets you define, hey, instead of tying this at the instance or host level, let's tie it down to the pod itself. Then we also have to answer for how do we manage 15 clusters, and that's where we ended up using a tool called Rancher, which is a very similar model to what StackRox does, where you launch an agent on each of your clusters that dials into a central application, and then from there you're able to manage the entirety of your Kubernetes footprint. Also, managing permissions. Are engineers able to access those clusters? Within those clusters, what are they able to do? And that's where we ended up looking at AWS config maps. And then those are just a few examples. They're still dealing with Kubernetes secrets. They're still dealing with communication between the nodes. So what if all of a sudden my front end server is trying to talk directly to my back end? I should be aware of that. That should be blocked. It should something, alarm should go off. So I mentioned that because switching to Kubernetes wasn't a magic bullet. It wasn't a quick, hey, look, everything's done, we're good to go, life goes forward. So some of those things I mentioned are ways that we answered the security question for us, and even then, that's only a portion of things. I do want to take the opportunity to show this diagram to everybody. I'm sure everybody here has seen some version of this diagram before, but I wanted to emphasize it during this call today because there are a lot of AWS services that you just don't have to worry about. You just pay the bill, or they're included as part of your bill. You use it, you're a consumer, you're good to go. And there's a lot of them like SQS and SNS, and to a certain degree RDS, where it's just plug and play until you start doing things at a crazy scale, at which point some architecture is needed. EKS is not any of those things. EKS is firmly infrastructure as a service. What that means is that Amazon will host the controller for you, and it will give you a few EC2 instances that are your hosts. That is it. Besides that, it is a vanilla Kubernetes deployment. The only exception, the only difference that I would tell you you'll have between EKS and maybe hosting it yourself in the cloud or hosting it yourself on-prem is that AWS will control what features are available on the controller, which makes absolute sense, right? They want to make sure it's stable and supported and something that works in their infrastructure. If you're running it yourself, you can run the bleeding edge controller and access all those features there. But for us, at least, we didn't need any of those features, and in return, we got reduced overhead in addition to increased stability. So again, Kubernetes infrastructure as a service. So I already addressed how we handled a lot of the problems we had around user management and permissions, around how our pods are able to access different resources in AWS, but there's still a huge thing that hasn't been addressed, right? Which is what images are running out there. Are they vulnerable? Have they been approved to run out there? Did they go through the proper CI/CD channels, get the proper checks, etc.? And in addition to that, how is our cluster behaving? Is it all of a sudden, again, our front end is communicating with our back end in some unexpected way? Who gets notified? What's going on? And then finally, even going to what we said earlier, compliance, right? A lot of compliance that exists today is written for a world that just frankly doesn't exist anymore. A lot of compliance assumes that you're either running your own EC2 instance or you're running your own bare metal server, and you'll get audit questions like, does your container support SSH? And the clear answer is SSH isn't even installed. This doesn't apply to us. And we still needed a tool that helped us understand from a compliance standpoint, how are we doing for things that are actually meaningful to us? So here's
Let me understate that a little bit, because I think that's a very intriguing point, because if in the model we had one major service, and we didn't even have the first services containerized because Elastic Beanstalk didn't require that, right? So we were giving Elastic Beanstalk source code, but we were trusting that it was standing up an EC2 instance with some dependencies on there that we really had no idea what they were, right? You have an EC2 instance that has some images and some bootstrap things, and we don't even know what it is, but we're trusting that our application is laid on top of that stack. So like, if you can go to the slide before real quick, Ken, like that middle line, you can kind of think of Elastic Beanstalk as a PaaS that you give it an application and you point it at some data and does some other stuff. But even then, you could question like all that stuff in the green. Who is, Amazon is looking at that, but Amazon also expects you to be aware of what it is and how it's working and if it works for you. And I to be honest, like that is a hard question to answer. And that's part of the reason Ken said like the operational complexity versus the flexibility. Why Kubernetes was a little better choice for us, because we have a little more control over some of those things about what we lay on our infrastructure and what goes in there. But even then, you have to understand what's going in your app, and not even knowing what's in one app, now you multiply that by 30 apps and you're running different languages with different dependency trees, different frameworks, different runtimes. A simple story, right, is that if you are writing your Docker images and you're using Alpine version 3.11, like we have people that would write, oh, use Alpine 3, use Alpine 3.11, use Alpine 3.2. So different service teams are pinning the version of Alpine at different tiers. So today that all looks good and it passes security checks and things going. Not a single line of code changes, but over time that image gets built hundreds of times. And a month from now, the team that didn't pin the version to 3.11.2 now has a whole bunch of dependencies that aren't on the other teams. And we would never know any of that if we didn't have some sort of visualization or some sort of partner on top of that. So that dumps into the next slide.
Yeah,
and before we go there, Ken, we've had some questions that I think I would love to try to entertain before we get to your point about overlaying security, if we can. Is that okay, guys?
Yeah.
So this is a really big one, and if it's sort of like too big, we can wait on it. But it's talking about what strategy did you use to go from your first MVP, which you talked about being built in monolith, and moving that into microservices? Like, how did you approach that? I think it's a big question, but a lot of people struggle with that. Where do you start?
I think Chris and I can both answer this in stages, just because there's different components that tie into that, right? The very first thing I will point out, and maybe this is a philosophical difference, but at Greenlight, we made the decision day one, we don't just want to transfer our monolith into a container. That just didn't make sense to us. That's not what a container is supposed to do. A container is supposed to be single purpose, focused, small, narrow, straightforward. So one of the first things we started doing before we ever looked at even Kubernetes is we actually briefly stopped in ECS, because we did know that we wanted to do containers. That really wasn't a question for us. It was just a matter of where do we want to host it. So when we started going to ECS, we made the decision to, all right, any new services going forward should be containers, period. In addition to that, what we should start doing, and this process did take us roughly a year. In addition to that, as we're updating the monolith, let's start chunking it out and creating new microservices from that, so that the monolith gets broken down, we are able to keep updating, keep adding new features, etc., while also progressing our infrastructure forward, right? So this just comes to the old saying of how do you eat an elephant, right? One bite at a time. And for our container journey, that was very much the approach we took. Just because if anybody tries to tell their business, their PMs, hey guys, no new features, no new anything for the next 2 quarters, that's not going to go well. And if you try it, let me know, because it should be pretty hilarious, especially as you're trying to communicate the value of something to a business that just doesn't really care about the infrastructure. They want to see the app updating and working and doing all the things it needs to do. They don't worry as much about, hey, how quickly are deployments happening? How is your automation working, etc. They just want the end result, and it is your job to figure out that in between. So that was the approach regarding containers. As far as deciding what platform we ended on, that was very much just trying to figure out how much we were willing to pay or tolerate, how much overhead we were willing to take on for what we were doing. And again, ECS is nice if you don't have an infrastructure team, if you have a very simple application that doesn't have any east-west traffic, if you have stateless containers, ECS might be the right tool for you, right? But with Kubernetes, we're able to have very intelligent east-west traffic. We can look into things like Istio and Envoy or Console or any of the other service discovery, service mesh tools, Kube2IM, to again restrict who's able to do what, etc. Now, the trade-off for that is, again, using Kubernetes isn't free, but at Greenlight, we had the expertise in-house that it made sense to support Kubernetes. But again, we chose to do that in the cloud because it didn't add value for us to do it on-prem or even in the cloud with us managing the entire thing. That's additional complexity that just didn't add value for us.
I think that's super helpful for the audience. Okay, I am mindful of time, so I do want you to be able to get to your next point, because I think it's super important. You set up here the whole notion of shared responsibility. We definitely see a lot of confusion on this front. We see people are like, well, I'm in the cloud, so everything's more or less taken care of for us. And I think you're, reiterating this piece, and it's super important. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing this part.
Yeah, and one thing I would add to that, and I think Chris and I at this point have said this 3 or 4 times, but I just want to reiterate it again. When you're designing how you scale, it can't be directly tied to how many people we're hiring, and security for us was very much the same way. So with StackRox, what we were able to do was automatically add StackRox to our CI/CD. It will automatically do all the checks we needed to do, and then our engineers are then able to say, hey, look, my build failed, and here's why it failed, and it gave them the ability to turn around and say, hey, look, my Alpine version is tied to something that is really old, let me go ahead and update it. And that's in contrast to the old school style of the sort of waterfall method where it goes from dev to QA to security at some point, and then security spends a few weeks doing their things, and then they come back and say, yay, we're great to go, or hey, developers, stop everything you're doing because your deployment isn't going forward until you fix the security issues, and then restart the cycle at that point, right? This is just good DevOps, increasing that feedback loop so that in minutes a developer is aware if there's some glaring issue with their deployment versus weeks, at which point they've already changed context, they've already handed it off to another team and considered it done.
Yeah, and that's not, that point, it can't be understated, I guess, is that we blew up this knowledge base that we had around Node.js and a group of 8 to 10 developers that understood it, and they knew that the security check meant run npm audit. Okay, we're good to go, push to production, right? That was like the general pattern, that as long as they stayed within some well-defined best practices, that most likely things were going to be okay. But that team was responsible for designing, implementing, deploying, operating, maintaining. Had PagerDuty calls, right? And now when that blows up to 30 services of 7 or 8 different languages, the models break down. You have a vacuum of knowledge that you can't just go hire your way out of. There's no security team sitting on the back end of all this waiting to pick up the trash from what is being shoveled through the engineering process. So you got to think about that buzzword DevSecOps as a very culturally important concept. Like, how do I get this baked into what people are doing day to day? How do I make sure it's part of what I'm doing, and how do I give visibility? And our model has been from day one to try to get all of the tools in the hands of the engineers, kind of stealing from Amazon, that a service team owns a service, they run the service, they expose things to other people within the team, but that service is theirs to operate and run and secure. We try to do that, and so the points that we made at the bottom were not just made as slide deck points. They were realistic, that when we chose partners and we chose tools, those tools had to fit in how we were thinking about the world, had to fit into how we were thinking about shared responsibility in our team, not just shared responsibility across cloud providers. So we needed it to deploy the way we wanted to deploy. We needed to align with our organizational strategy. We needed it to help us get better at the places where we've had this void in knowledge because we've scattered to microservices. And that's, to me, the benefit of where the tools that we chose, StackRox being one of those tools that fit into that strategy, that helped us make sense of where we were and not do it in a way where it would just go hire a team and let them deal with that.
Waterfall is
I think that's
period.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you guys talked about 2 dimensions of trying to keep up. One dimension is, as the service scales, how do you hire enough people just to build that service and maintain that service? But the other dimension that I think has been painful for a very long time is the gap between just the sheer number of developers you have and the number of security people you have. That's always been a gap. But it feels like that gap is growing because companies need to invest in building innovative applications, but they cannot invest in headcount in security at the same rate. Like, the business is not going to sustain that, cannot sustain that. So I think your focus on, looking for tooling that fit into your processes and fit into your pace and fit into your mindset around, one-stop shop, right? This is the group that runs this service top to bottom, and the tooling needs to fit into that. It's not living in another dimension. It's not run by a separate team. I think it's a great lesson.
The part where the microservices strategy too, if you think about the monolithic model, like literally that chart that Ken showed, it's just had a blob in the middle of the screen, like that was the architecture. You had 3 or 4 lines coming into that. And so as long as you knew how to secure those 3 lines, good to go. Now you multiply that by 30, now you've got 30 times 3, you got 90 connection points that are now going all over the place in every way, up, down, left, right, east, west, north, south. How are you going to manage that, right? What is your strategy for doing that? And I think that's stuff that it seems sexy when you look at microservices and like, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. But when you get into the reality of microservices, those are the things that you've got to solve that there's no easy answer for.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we have a lot of questions and I want to get to them. I just want to quickly echo a couple of things that Chris and Ken said. So Ken, if you don't mind zipping forward 1 slide there. You talked a lot. Oh, let's find out what everybody else cares about. Yes, this is a good point to do that. Alan, can you help us?
I'm ready. I had my finger on the button, Michelle. I was just waiting. Okay, our last poll, guys. And I'd like to see a big turnout on this one. So what are your top 3 use cases for security for Kubernetes environments? Select only one, please. Is it vulnerability management?
I think they can pick multiple.
Oh, it says select up to 3. Duh, thank you. And sometimes my reading isn't what it should be. You can select up to 3 of these guys: vulnerability management, compliance, configuration management, network segmentation, threat detection, and incident response. Oh, come on, only a third of you voted. More of you. I know there's a lot in here, but pick 3. I need a couple more people here to vote. Okay, I feel like I'm a politician, Michelle. Mail-in ballots or what? Anyway, all right, we're going to close voting here in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Polls closed, and share results. Survey says.
Yep.
What do you think, guys?
Very interesting. We see a lot of vulnerability management. I mean, it makes a ton of sense. One, everybody knows they have to do it, so it's not like it's a surprise. And it's always the starting point. So I think a lot of people, especially if you think about the audience that we're talking to today, where they're saying 49% still learning about Kubernetes, it's the obvious starting point. So it makes a ton of sense.
I think vulnerability management was the obvious starting point when we talk about Kube and cloud native security. I think very quickly, though, people realize that's almost legacy, if you will, right? Scanning your
Right.
Kube environment for vulnerabilities is, what difference did it make if you were on Kube or VMware or on-prem? You still scan for vulnerabilities. I think compliance in a Kubernetes environment, as Ken mentioned, some of it is rendered, especially in the cloud, some of it is rendered sort of obsolete, and we're still exploring that. I think configuration management and security in Kubernetes is a huge problem. Threat detection and incident response, I'm actually surprised to see it that high, Michelle, but we are seeing a lot of people looking now at malware within containers and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So,
and runtime does tend to come
higher.
a little second. Yeah. No, I mean, runtime tends to lag the others because it's the blessing and the curse. You know, Chris, I think it was, made this point that Kubernetes and containers solve a lot of problems, but they create a lot of problems. It's this crazy cycle. They solve a bunch of problems. They create a bunch of security problems, but then they actually also have the ingredients to solve those security problems. It's really fascinating. There's a lot of give and take there. So we'll just quickly cover off a couple more quick points, and then we'll go into the questions that are here. We'll get to as many of them as we can, guys. I recognize we're just a few minutes before the hour.
Goodness.
So Ken, if you're able to advance.
Yeah, actually, since I'm controlling the presentation, I can hold it hostage. I want to add one thing to what I want to add one thing to what you just said, because I think the context is really, really important. Kubernetes solves all of the problems it solves by creating a cloud within the cloud. And the reason I want to emphasize that is because just like in AWS, you have your security groups and you have your IAMs and you have all these things that you have to account for. Kubernetes is no different, and you have to be aware of that whenever you're thinking about it from a security standpoint.
Yeah. So I just want to quickly echo a lot of, and Ken, this is exactly your point. So Kube extends the threat vectors in some dimensions. It has its own sense of, or its own set of attack matrix. Microsoft did a great post recently on the Kubernetes threat matrix, and it's well worth looking at. But it really does also at the same time provide you with a lot of goodness to go solve those security problems. And the first big one is context, like Ken just said. When you have a rich set of information, you can be much more intelligent about what's going on in your infrastructure. So one of the things that we try to do here at Stackrocks in terms of blending security and DevOps and really trying to bake that into the process is to pull all that context. What do we know about these deployments? We can tell from network segmentation policies if it's open to the internet. We can tell from labels and annotations if it's a really critical app. We can tell from cluster naming convention if it's running in test or in prod. So wouldn't it be nice to prioritize what you need to go fix? You might have the same vulnerability 48 times, but let's go fix the 3 where it's in prod and it's up on the internet and it's got customer data and all that, right? It's the Equifax struts problem. Everybody knew about struts. They just hadn't gotten to that one yet. What if that was at the top of your list, so you got to it first, right? So that context to prioritize risk is super helpful. So Ken, stepping forward again. Thank you. Compliance. So Ken talked about how this isn't a big point for this audience, so we won't spend a lot of time here, but the world's totally different, and not all compliance issues are relevant. So StackRox actually took the time to go into PCI and HIPAA and NIST and go line for line in each of those controls and say relevant, not relevant in a container world, and then provide specific checks against it. So that's what you see in those sundials. So you get ongoing, continuous, as well as on-demand checks, and beyond the pretty pictures, you get detailed Excel if you need that for your auditors, when you need that for your auditors, but it's relevant to a container and kube world. And then just last quick point, Ken, on the next slide, and we'll get to these questions. Reducing the blast radius. So Kube is first and foremost a developer's tool. Everything can talk to everything because I want to make my app work. And that's great when you're in dev, and it's harrowing when you're in prod. And it's really easy to miss this. And so one of the things that we set out to do is to paint a picture for you of what's going on in your environment. We can read those kube policies, those YAML files, show you what's going on in your environment, highlight nodes that are completely non-isolated, and then, better than that, baseline your environment. Look at how your app's running, what's talking to what. This is really all that's needed. Present to you a new YAML file that says, look, this is the batten down approach, right? This is the least privilege model. And then you have the option to apply those YAML policies, or we would recommend follow DevOps best practices, send that over to the team, have them test everything. But we'll produce that YAML file for you automatically so that you can reduce that blast radius really simply. So I recognize we're just a couple of minutes from the end of the hour here. Ken and Chris have been super supportive. So, Ajman, Razvan, Nirav, Ryan, I see all these questions, and we will definitely take them up with you offline. I'm just trying to see if there's one that's more pertinent that I'm seeing multiple times. There's a lot of questions around vulnerabilities, looking at vulnerabilities, and how do you bake that into CI/CD model. So if you want to just quickly touch on that one, we'll take that one live, and then we'll take the rest of them offline.
Vulnerabilities in the CI/CD model. I think one of the things is integration with pipelines and doing checks and that risk model, right? It's interesting to see where we get some insight on this, where if we do have a Docker container that has different versions of a base container at the top, right? There's ways which you can control that, and golden images and all this stuff that you could do that big companies typically do to try to enforce rigidity. That's hard for us because we don't have a team enforcing that, right? So engineers do stuff, it gets PR'd, stuff slips through the cracks, and you choose an older version of Alpine than the next person, or you choose a pen version versus a non-pen version. If you just say latest, and it keeps rolling down the chain. What we see and what we're allowed to see in this is the risk profile changing in the different environments. And so as stuff pops up and we can understand what it is, this is where we can identify those things like, oh, you know what, we shouldn't have done that. Okay, Slack message out to the engineering team, don't use this version, use this version of Alpine or something like that, right? So that generates activity on ours without being rigid pipeline constructs, but we can start to bake in some of this stuff into our CI/CD pipeline to get automatic feedback of those things. And one thing that I found super useful, I don't know if the rest of the group has, it's not necessarily CI/CD, but when we do deployments and we have different environments like the screen you're seeing shown right now, we should not have communication going from a namespace to a namespace. Kubernetes doesn't block that for you by default, right? But
Chris, I think we might have lost you. Yeah.
Lost Chris's audio. Ken, can you guess what he was going to say?
So
Kind of lip read.
what Chris was going to say there is we define environments by namespaces. So accordingly, we need a way to block communication so that the QA services cannot talk to the dev services or the staging services. So that's where the network implementation is able to help us accomplish that, and it's help us to see is something talking to something it shouldn't.
Guys, I need to jump in here. We're at the top of the hour. I apologize. I need to announce Blake H. and Andrew H. are our two winners of the $50 Amazon gift cards today. You'll get an email with instructions on how to get your gift cards. Thanks for attending. Thanks everyone for attending. As Michelle mentioned, we have more than a dozen, maybe a dozen and a half questions there. Michelle, you and the team will be busy. But thank you for joining us today for another great webinar on cloud native security. Thanks to the Greenlight guys here, Ken, Chris. I don't know if your audio is back on yet, Chris, but you know what? It's hard finding organizations who are willing to come out and talk like this and give people the benefit of your experience, try to save them what I always like to call the idiot tax, right? From the mistakes you made and learning from them. So thank you, and thank you both and your whole organization. Michelle, what can I say? You make my job easy, always. Thank you. This is Alan Schimmel.
Thanks, Ken and Chris.
Yep. This is Alan Schimmel from Media Ops, Stack Rocks, Greenlight. Hope you've enjoyed this. We'll get to the questions. We'll see you soon in another webinar. Take care, everyone.